The Enlightenment was full of promise and full of progress. The world was experiencing scientific advancement, exploration, and world peace that had not been imagined before, probably in human history, at least on that scale. Um, Hegel argued that every generation comes up with a thesis, the next generation an antithesis, and then the third generation synthesizes those two. This synthesis becomes the new thesis. But there's this upward progression, and then you have the new antithesis and the new thesis. And then on and on and on upward it goes. At the same time, you have Darwinian thought, which is teaching evolution. And in evolution, things are developing from more lower forms to higher forms, a lack of complexity to complexity. This theory is taking on an anthropological term, and so evolution is not just being applied to the sciences, but it's also being applied to other fields. So that as anthropologists are looking at other cultures, they are seeing this kind of chronological progression, where progression is the ideal, and then they're kind of working backwards to primitive cultures. The same thing is true in religious studies. And so all of these things, there's this idealized upward progression of humanity. And then through World War II, through the Holocaust, through the atomic bomb, and many other things like that, this optimism was shattered, utterly shattered. Just like the first century preachers whose preaching was based on the immediate return of Christ, the colonial era missionaries who were preaching the same message, as the return of Christ continues to tarry, even though they had taken over much of the known world and planted churches throughout the world, their eschatology left them waiting and wanting. And so the Enlightenment era has kind of run its course. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction on paradigms, paradigms don't just die and go away; they coexist. And so this week's session on the postmodern paradigm is a little bit difficult to define. In many ways, it's against the former paradigm, and it hasn't necessarily found its full footing yet. And the reality is that many organizations, so probably before taking this class, you would assume your understanding of mission whenever you would hear the word mission. And so maybe that was based on your denomination's organization or some organization you'd taken a trip with. And the reality is that for many mission agencies, they are operating in the way that they did a long time ago, both structurally, from a paradigm level. In many ways, they are operating as they did at their inception. Many have changed and transformed. Agencies like the International Mission Board have gone through many shifts over time. Under Jerry Rankin, there was a big shift called New Directions. This was back in the late 90s. And at the time, there were IMB missionaries who were staffing positions in denominations and churches in other countries. New Directions completely changed that. From that point forward, if there was an established church, a national should run it. If there was an established denomination, nationals should hold those positions. And so the only positions that IMB missionaries held after that were either kind of frontline church planting, or they coined the phrase strategic coordinator type positions, or a lot of them shifted into education and or relief. And so it was much more kind of spot training type stuff that they were doing. But there are a number of factors that the colonial world gave way to on into postmodernism, and the first is there's a huge movement from colonialism into post-colonialism. So if you think of colonialism as being this big brother who beats up his little brother every day and takes his lunch money and makes his little brother do his homework and all this kind of stuff. Now imagine that the little brother is the same size as the big brother, and now imagine that the big brother had 7 little brothers, and all 7 little brothers have grown up to be the same size that he is, or larger in some cases, and they are now collectively standing on their own against him. This is kind of how the post-colonial movement happened, and so different nations won their independence. Again, we're dealing with this thematically, not chronologically. So you go back into most colonized countries' history, their Independence Day, sometimes early 1900s, mid 1900s, some as late as 60s and 70s, and oftentimes there's a strong post-colonial reaction. I want to give you just a picture of the scaling down effect that has been occurring. And so this is from Samuel P. Huntington. He wrote a book called Clash of Civilizations. I'm going to disagree with him quite stringently when we talk about the globalization paradigm. But in some of his other theory, I think he has some interesting points to make. He's talking about Western colonialism, and he says that the turn to putting things back in national control began slowly in the 1920s and 1930s and accelerated dramatically in the aftermath of World War II. The collapse of the Soviet Union brought independence to additional Muslim societies. So he's speaking specifically about the colonized Muslim powers. So Europeans had colonized much of North Africa and the Middle East, and then and the Far East and Central Asia, but Russia had also kind of created their own colonial system in the Stans region. And so a lot of these were returning to local control. He says the collapse of the Soviet Union brought independence to additional Muslim societies. According to one count, some 92 acquisitions of Muslim territory by non-Muslim governments occurred between 1757 and 1919. Some 92 countries were acquired by outside nations. By 1995, 69 of these territories were once again under Muslim rule, and about 45 independent states had overwhelming Muslim majority populations. And so he is describing this massive shift, one, towards acquiring colonies, and then second, this great reversal. But as these countries gained their independence, there was typically a very anti-Western bent that their first governments had. Oftentimes the church took on a similar role, a similar sentiment towards Westerners. And in Egypt, for instance, President Nasser, when he came to power, he was the first true Egyptian, and by true Egyptian I mean not a puppet of someone else. So the French had come in and colonized for a brief period, and then this was under Napoleon. And then after Napoleon, the Brits had come in and colonized for a long time. And when they left, they had already built a lot of infrastructure. They had built the Suez Canal. This had been a significant investment for them, and they wanted to protect their investment. And they left King Farouk in power. King Farouk was known to be one, a very weak leader. Two, he was sold out to protecting British interests and influence. And then three, he was also known for being a very immoral man. And so in a conservative Muslim country, immorality does not fly very well. And so when they ran him out, President Nasser became president. His first step was to nationalize all of the foreign companies, to nationalize the Suez Canal, to take control of all of that stuff. And then in a show of power and trying to regain honor, the very next thing he did was attack Israel, which wound up ending quite badly for him. But this was the mindset of, we have been humiliated, and we've been humiliated long enough. It's time to take control of our lives, and it's time to push back. And this became a global sentiment that marks this era. And so one of the changes that happened for missionaries is it became difficult, if not impossible, to get missionary visas in many places that they had, particularly in the Muslim world or in any of the former Ottoman Empire countries. There was this thing called the capitulations, and this was what the Ottoman Empire did to allow for free trade with Europe. So prior to the Crusades, there was very strong trade between the Europeans and the Muslim world. After the Crusades, this completely severed it until the time of the Ottomans. During the Ottoman Empire, with the capitulations, they basically allowed you, if you were a foreigner, to not have to live by local law, but to abide by your home country's law. And so there were certain anti proselytization elements of Islam, of course, that Westerners were not beholden to because they were from the outside. Missionaries obviously used this to their advantage to go in and to share the gospel. And so they were allowed to go in and to operate in these countries based on the capitulations. Well, as these countries regained their power, politically they had the control to say, no, you can't do this anymore. And that's exactly what happened. As they began to push missionaries out and deny missionary visas throughout much of the world. So most of the world today, even modern countries, even Christian countries, it's very difficult to get a missionary visa. And so this is one of the things that changed, particularly with religions. One of the elements that colonial missionaries would do is they would focus on children, and they would focus on things like literacy. So their methods were to bring in literacy, to bring in Bibles, to create schools, and they would particularly focus on poor areas. And so in countries like India, Christianity was associated with the lower castes, and it was viewed to be kind of this untouchable religion. It was also viewed to be weak because it was starting with, and some of this was out of the social gospel movement or a push for justice or a concern for the poor. There was a concern for the least of these that is viewed to be weak by religions that focus on honor and power and respect. And so if you would have seen Hinduism 100 years ago or 200 years ago, it would look very different from today. So Hinduism used to be a broad buffet of things, of all things that it meant to be Indian. After interacting with missionaries for a number of generations and parents watching their children leave the faith, they were forced to provide definition to what does it mean, what exactly is Hinduism. And so that began to be codified, so to speak. And now you actually have Hindu denominations. In a strange twist of fate, as many globalization, as many nations are now having moved out of their country, people moved out of their home country and are living in the States or other places for that matter. In Houston, we have multiple denominations of Hinduism represented here in our city. Islam follows a similar course, particularly in Egypt. I reference Egypt because it's the most populous Arab country. Not all Muslims are Arab, and not all Arabs are Muslim, for that matter. But it is it is the most populous Arab country. In Egypt, in particular, the colonial missionaries are partly responsible for the birth of a political movement. What was briefly a terrorist organization and then returned to being a political movement called the Muslim Brotherhood. And so you've probably heard a lot about them in the news. If you watch the news, particularly during the Arab Spring, they won the next election after the president had been deposed. And they started as an education movement. So the founder and the main kind of spokesperson later, they were both educators. In fact, Syed Qutb, who is one of the main people who were very influential in both Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood movement, he came to the United States during 1948 to 1950 to work on a master's in education. And they were learning education and promoting education because the missionaries were going to poor villages and they were focusing on basically farmer peasants, and they were setting up schools for them. And so if you were a farmer peasant at that time, you had to choose between your children going to a school and being Christianized as well as educated, or your children remaining poor and of your faith. So the Muslim Brotherhood sought to promote education so that there was an Islamic alternative. This obviously has another side effect in many of these countries, as now people who were once just secular Muslims, maybe Muslim in a more surface way, are now being more educated in their ways. And so it actually has allowed Islam to become, and Hinduism for that matter, to become more entrenched in people's minds and in society. And since the 1970s in particular, there have been revival movements of both Hinduism and Islam in India and in the Middle East, respectively. And so these are this strong post-colonial and anti-colonial push is something that you see happening throughout the world, or has already happened, really. And then finally, in this point, new theologies are being developed by recently emancipated churches and denominations. So as the foreign rule and influence is waning, and the local influence is growing, their own theologians are beginning to create their own sets of theology. Paul Hebert is one of the people who have argued for what he calls a fourth self. So from our last lecture, we have self-supporting, self-propagating, and self-governing. And so Paul Hebert adds to that self-theologizing. And Christopher Wright, who's written the book, The Mission of God, very big, thick book. You'll see it on a lot of people's mission people's shelves. He writes about a missional hermeneutic to read the Bible. And he actually talks about this idea of global theology now coming online and how controversial this seems to people who are in the West. We always think our theology is the theology. We just call it theology. Then we talk about Latin American theology, Asian theology, African theology. But the reality is that Western theology is just that. It's Western theology. And so he argues that the hermeneutics of the Reformation, that Luther and the Reformers should have the right to interpret the scriptures apart from papal influence and apart from the church, this is now being applied in a global context, but we are kind of now sitting in the papal chair where we're going, no, you don't have the right to do this. And so there's even a tension theologically within former colonies and Western sources. Interestingly enough, a lot of this is directed towards us, maybe not by name, but in particular directed towards us as Americans because of how much influence we currently have in theological discussions and in mission circles globally. And so even though we were not the colonizing force, we are joined with other Western powers in the minds of the colonized. One of the other things that happened during this time period is that there's a doubt in absolutism. This kind of positivity, or logical positivism, as Paul Hebert calls it, it's no longer an assumed principle. A generation ago, it was an assumed principle, and even within our own country, you can see this debate occurring between two generations, where one generation just assumes truth exists, and I know it, and you're wrong. And then the other generation says, well, that's your perspective. That's how you see the situation. And the younger generations tend to be much more quick to nuance a discussion or a disagreement or see politics in a different light. And this is the result of positivism decreasing. So science had not produced, it had eradicated religion in people's minds. So science and religion at one point became at odds with each other, and science was winning. And the promise that it was giving is this absolute, unbiased, acultural, ahistorical body of knowledge. But what it was taking away was meaning and purpose and belonging and community, and in its place giving secularization and individualism and other things like this. And so science is a cold master, and in this new paradigm, the world is seeking answers of meaning, not just of causality. And this is why, particularly in Western culture, we're increasing to secularize. People are not, the world is not, as many people had thought, going to go to a post-religious or a-religious society. We're actually becoming more religious, just less Christian. And so you'll hear many young people today talk about, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. And so people have very clearly defined ways of thinking, worldviews that provide them meaning in a religious kind of context, but are not creedal religions such as Christianity. And even if they're borrowing from Buddhism and Hinduism or any of the Eastern beliefs, they tend to not identify with those formal isms, they borrow in a kind of smorgasbord type way. Essentially, the denominationalizing effect that Hinduism had on Hinduism is now being de-denominationalized, if I can completely invent a word there. They are taking away its creedal form, its label, because for many people in our generation, labels are viewed to be a bad thing. I always love it when people say, don't label me, I'm millennial, or don't label me, I'm postmodern. It's kind of an ironic little twist. But there's this doubt in absolutism. There's no longer just this unquestioned science has all the answers for life. Typically, kind of across the board, people are looking for other answers that science cannot provide. But one thing that has happened is religion has become relative. So we talked about in the Reformation period all the way back, the word religion was never used to describe religions, plural, or to describe other people's religions. The idea that there was God, he was the God of the Bible, and this is just known in absolute, and then there's everything else. This was a common belief up until the Enlightenment. Well, now, not only is there an understanding and an awareness of other religions, which I think is important. I think we need to understand the religious context that the people we're sharing the gospel with are coming from. But there's not just an understanding of other religions. There is a bit of credence. Now, this works in two ways. There's a positive version where we give credence to everybody. Every religion has some spark of truth, who is to judge, etc., etc. But then there's the negative way, which says, well, all religions are talking about the same thing, but they're doing this in a way of, and they're all kind of equally false. So there's still this secular mindset of religion is, if we draw a line in half, we have science and positive knowledge, and then we have subjective feeling, religious knowledge, etc. In this era, progress is looking more like regress, and people look to nature. We have not gotten better at taking care of the world. The materialism and the scientific overcoming and subjugation of the world has led to exploitation. And people have noticed this. Younger generations have noticed this. Global generations have noticed this. And so they're realizing the world is in more trouble than it was 50 years ago. And we have to turn back. There's regress in terms of economy and human condition. Poverty is on the rise. The disparity between the haves and the have-nots, the upper class and the lower class. All of these things have increased during this time, and it is viewed as being problematic. There's always been rich and poor throughout history, in places like India with the upper castes and the untouchables. Huge disparity, but now these things are not just being viewed as a matter of fact of, well, there's God, king, God, religion, king, and nobles, the people, and the earth, and just this is the accepted order. Now it's questioned, and so it's no longer accepted that if you have money, well, that's just your divine right. You were born into nobility, and that's the way that God, or the gods, depending on which religious side of this you're looking at it from, have just ordained it. And so I just need to accept my lot as, being an untouchable or being in poverty. Well, now people are realizing, and part of this does come from the enlightenment of we can change this. People are realizing this should change. And so there's this doubt in all of these absolute categories that were just viewed to be A is A. Now people are looking at that as, well, A might be A, but I don't like A. I want to change A. There's a rise in secularism, which is interesting. So we're kind of growing more religious and more secularized at the same time. And some of that's because there's increasing, we'll call it sectionality, or think of the world like a waffle rather than a pancake. So in the old world, the world is a pancake, and you pour syrup on the middle, and it just spreads over the whole pancake. So we have, the Christian Empire, and we just pour enough of the gospel syrup on top, and it's just going to spread everywhere. Well, now the world is like a waffle, and I would say it's more like a stack of waffles. And so, we don't, in order to get syrup onto a waffle, you have to pour it into each individual square if you want it to be covered. And so with secularism, in some sectors, in some quadrants of the waffle, it is on the rise among Western people, those who are in North America and or Europe, or now those places are very diverse. Okay, so those are the Western people is not such a helpful category, but so I'm recognizing that in my term. But religion is falling at the same time through mass immigration and people bringing religions and operating from more of a pre-modern epistemology where God is still assumed and religion is still important and central and the family is essential. That is how I can say religion is both on the rise and falling at the same time. And so there is this sense where secularism is happening. Samuel P. Huntington says, in rapidly modernizing societies, if the traditional religion is unable to adapt to the requirements of modernization, the potential exists for the spread of Western Christianity and Islam. In these societies, the most successful protagonists of Western culture are not the neoclassical economists or crusading Democrats or multinational corporation executives. They are, and most likely to be, Christian missionaries. Neither Adam Smith, this is not a religious book, by the way, neither Adam Smith nor Thomas Jefferson will meet the psychological, emotional, and moral and social needs of urban migrants and first-generation secondary school graduates. Jesus Christ may not meet them either, but he is likely to have a better chance. And so, as there have been forces like communism with its push towards enforcing atheism and other effects like this, as science has had that own effect, maybe not from a governmental standpoint, but just from a rational standpoint, a cognitive standpoint, as these things have happened, it's actually paved the way for Christian religion. But it has to be a different way than it was brought about before. And so for people who are still wanting to focus on kind of the political takeover, and again, this is where we see multiple paradigms happening at the same time. We still have people who think our job is to make the church take over the government and have a Christian government and enforce our will on the masses. I think there's a lot of room for Christianity in the United States and in the West, in postmodern cultures. And there's actually more room created because these gods of science and rationalism and empiricism have been moved, and materialism have been moved out of the way. They've been shown to be false, weak gods that have left people wanting. And so there's actually room now. There's kind of been a vacuum created in this postmodern paradigm.